Welcome to the Beyond the Horizons podcast, where we delve into and expand upon some of the key issues raised in the Enable 2024 MSP Horizons report, produced in conjunction with Canalys. In this episode, we take a deep dive into secure by default strategies with Enable security experts Dave MacKinnon and Jim Waggoner. We discover why MSPs need to move beyond secure by design, embracing out-of-the-box security that builds resilience, streamlines operations, and keeps clients safer in an evolving threat landscape. Welcome. In today's podcast, we're going to be looking at how MSP products need to move to the next level of security. So that's moving to a secure by default architecture. And to help me with that discussion, I'm joined today by Enable's Chief Security Officer, Dave MacKinnon, also known as DMAC, and Jim Waggoner, our VP of Security Products. Jim, I'm not sure if you have a shortened nickname, but I'm thinking maybe...
No, they're trying to come up with ones.
Well, I'm thinking maybe to keep you on par with DMAC, we should just call you J-Dub for the sort of like for the course of this conversation. I thought DMAC and J-Dub kind of fitted quite nicely together. But anyway, so first question, really, I suppose, Dave. Let's start by really defining what's the difference between secure by design and secure by default.
Sure. So I actually, before I go there, I think I have some really good nicknames for Jim, but I'll share those after this podcast. But
Thanks.
What I really see the two is they go hand in hand. So when you talk about security by design, it's coming up with how do you ensure that as you build a product in the product development life cycle, that is secure as possible. So you're making sure that you go through threat attack vectors, you're ensuring that your code is secure, but it's all in the software development side. When we talk about secure by default, the outcome is really what you have as a secure product, and then how do you configure it in the most secure way without the customer having to go through steps to make that occur. So requiring things like MFA, making sure that you have logging and auditing, make sure that there's no default passwords, et cetera. So it's really, one is an extension of the other. Historically, we've talked about secure by design. I mean, I think that's been a buzzword in the industry for the last 10 plus years. But now really what we're talking about, and that's the shift, is to making sure that customers receive the most secure product out of the gate, and they don't have to jump through extra steps to secure it.
So it's almost more of a framework than anything else, would you say?
That's how I view it. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say it's out of the box for the secure by default. It's out of the box, secure by default. No changes, correct. No configurations. Everything is as it can be secure.
Yeah, and if you go back like 20 years ago, like you would get a firewall, and they didn't have the default deny. Like I'm definitely dating myself, but like you had to add that in and say, all right, if it doesn't meet these firewall rules, then you drop the traffic. It's basically saying, hey, I want to make sure we always drop that traffic. When you get it out of the box, you always drop the traffic that you don't trust. And it's making sure that inherently when you turn the product on, and like I think about my iPhone, or any phone, the first thing it has you do is set up a passcode. It's one of the very first things it has you do when you log into a new phone is to start securing it out of the box, and that's exactly what we want to make sure we're doing as we build our products.
And Jim, that's direct sort of coming, I suppose, off that really is what practical differences will MSPs experience when they're using secure by default products?
Yeah, secure by default. It's interesting. Like DMAC, I'm going to date myself here, but it was at one point in time when you would deliver product or ship product, the default configuration had to be to allow everything. You wanted to focus on ease of use. Yep. All traffic was allowed. Barely anything was scanned. All permissions were maximum so that everyone had full rights. And the reason why you did that was you wanted to optimize for no alerts, no impact to the business. And you didn't want anyone calling up the leaders, the head of IT, and saying, or the whatever corporation, and saying, "Hey, I need to turn this off. There's too many alerts." And so we all learned to change the configuration to throttle it back. But then the threatscape changed, and then once the threatscape changed, you needed to tighten up that security, and the security teams would come up with recommendations of everything that you needed to do. And that was for enterprise. Now I'm seeing it happen with MSPs as because they're responsible for the security of their customers, they're trying to figure out a way to make sure the environment they're protecting are the most secure that they can. And there is this transition to where there's an old guard, if you will, that still want it out of the box, everything allowed, and are learning to go secure by default. And the change is for them when they go from their old permissions to their new permissions, they do need to expect that employees are going to complain. Like here at Enable, when I first joined my last company, we like to consider ourselves secure. But in DMAX policies here, we're locked down. I mean, I've got passwords that are always changing, MFA. I'm always having to re-authenticate every single service that I'm at. And that is the experience you'll get if you're a partner when you first change over from the allow everything to block by default or be secure by default. After you get through that, though, I think that their job, call it operational efficiency, they're not going to be spending so much time on alerts and overhead because threats aren't getting through.
Mm-hmm. And I mean,
thanks for the permissions and policies there, DMAC.
Happy to do it.
One thing that kind of occurs to me when we're talking like this is is this kind of in a way intrinsically kind of linked to a move towards zero trust environments as well, or is that part and parcel of the same thing? Either
it isn't. I'll see what DMAC says. No, zero trust says I don't trust you at all. And I don't care who you are. I don't care what you want. I'm going to assume that you're just as bad as an external threat actor. I'm not going to trust an employee. So when I access the network, I'm just going to say no, and I re-authenticate constantly. Where secure by default is more, it's along the lines of being more secure, but it's not saying that I'm not trusting you. It says I'm going to trust you the least amount that I can. What do you think, DMAC?
No, I think that's fair, and I do think that, Jim, to kind of go back to what you said a few minutes ago, like there's been a shift, and it's been a pretty seismic shift as you talk about that SMB market over the last few years, which is the mindset of, hey, this isn't going to impact me, to I think now there's a realization that this is going to impact SMBs. Like they are in the crosshairs. We're seeing that across the board. MSPs are also in there, and there's I think there's more accepting of the change to folks' experience as it comes to security. Even inside of Enable, and Jim, I won't call anybody out specifically, but I may or may not have had somebody complained about the fact when we changed our MFA policies because they could no longer approve from their watch. It was like, oh, I used to be able to, on my Apple Watch, I could do the approve, and I was like, well, you can't do that. And now you have to type in a 2-digit code, and this was a couple years ago. And then fast forward, I think within probably a few months, there were numerous companies who got hit with MFA bombs. And when one of those engineers finally said, fine, just go, like, leave me alone, stop hitting me, they got through and they got into those enterprises. And I looked at that executive and I said, this is exactly why we don't allow that. We do create that additional hurdle, and it's a default. And now nobody complains about it because they understand the why. Oftentimes, especially in security, if you don't do a good job of explaining the why, that's where you get the complaints. And I think that's the other half of this coin that we don't talk about as much, is like, why are we doing these default configurations? Why do we make people jump through these hoops? My goal is not to make Jim's employee experience less enjoyable, but it is to ensure that, we know it's Jim, we know that it's Jim's laptop, he is the one who's authoring from his phone from an MFA perspective, and it gives us the boundaries and controls to understand that the identity we're dealing with, because ultimately that's the change too. I mean, that's the huge changes. If you look over the last few years, it used to be like, okay, you have the castle, you try and break into it. Now you have an identity. That identity gives you SaaS services everywhere. Well, we're a part of that ecosystem, especially Enable. How do we make sure we're protecting that ecosystem as they go through it to ensure that we're not a part of that overall attack vector? That's like, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to prevent, and that's why I think the secure by default is so critical.
Hey, DMAC, you use the term MFA bomb. What is that?
So basically, what happens is, if I have username and password, if I have your username and password, I'm going to keep trying to log in. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to get into M365. Jim, your password is password 123 bang or whatever. I don't know what the current default passwords, most used passwords are. And it says, okay, you need to MFA. So it's going to message your phone and say, hey, Jim, you need to go ahead and you're like, this isn't me. No, I'm going to do it again. You're like, it's not me. No, I'm going to do it again. And I keep doing it. And you get to the point you're like, this has to be one of my applications running my laptop. Okay, you're approved. And that's where the threat actor gets their initial foothold. The challenge is once you have your foot in that door, and especially as we talk about this kind of ecosystem with a large SaaS base, it's not like it used to be. It's like, okay, well, everything's inside that wall. You have your perimeter built up and you need to be on the VPN and all these things. Now it's all out on the internet. So that means I can jump potentially from your email to your CRM system to potentially a payroll system to your RMM system. Like, it allows you to move laterally kind of across the internet. So that MFA bomb is kind of that initial attempt to get the foothold into an environment where you've taken over that identity to then go begin doing whatever action you plan to take, whether it be stealing data, whether it be infiltrating a company, whatever the case may be.
Excellent. Thanks,
the only reason I didn't pull him up on that one actually, Jim, was because I've heard Dave talk about MFA bombs before, so I was kind of quite prepared for that one. But thank you for throwing that in there.
I give them out for Christmas presents too. So Jim, this year for Christmas.
So Dave, let's say you're an MSP. You're moving your customers, or you're moving to this kind of like secure by default architecture. How do you sell it to your customers? How do you explain to them that it's helping it's helping the MSP better protect their environment?
Yes, I think this is actually a talk we did a couple weeks ago at the Business Transformation event. It's moving away from talking about a security talk track, and it's talking about a resiliency talk track. Like, we are not doing these things to create hurdles for the business. We're creating these things to protect the business. And here's the why. So to me, as an MSP I'm going to go sell you like this pad of paper because this is the best pad of paper. It's made by, I'm not going to say the name because I don't know if we're allowed to, but instead of this other pad, the customer doesn't care, versus saying, I'm going to give you this yellow piece of paper that you're going to write your notes down on, and it's going to help you do your job. And this is, because you're capturing that information in a way that's useful to you in a safe manner, whatever the case may be. That's the resiliency I'm creating. Is I'm giving you the tools you need to make sure that you can run. It's not a security tool. Like, it's 100%, it's a resiliency tool. So that's kind of the pivot I personally believe MSPs need to make. They need to stop talking about go buy EDR. Go buy this tool, go buy that, because we get very, very tool heavy. And I don't go to the board. Like, when I sit down, we actually have a board meeting tomorrow. I don't go to the board and talk and be like, we need to go buy these 4 tools. Like, these are really important tools. I say, here's the business risk. Here's what we're going to do to address it. This is our time frame to do it. And this is how we're going to be resilient after the fact. That's my talk track. I never once mentioned what that tool stack is, because candidly, they don't care. Like, what they want to know is, what is the risk and how are we addressing the risk? And I think for MSPs, that's one of those pivots to move away from buy the tool versus this is how we're going to keep your business operating and secure so it has longevity. And that's ultimately what business owners want. They don't want to be out of business. They don't want to be able to not work. They don't want to lose customers. They want to make sure that they stay in business. And that I think is kind of the transition a lot of MSPs are going through right now, as they talk to customers about it.
Hey, let me add on to that, Pete.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
To add on to what DMAC is saying, exactly that. So, and from an MSP's perspective, when they're talking to each other, what I will overhear them as I eavesdrop, is one will say, listen, I've got a security stack recommendation. I'm going to deploy this entire security stack to your environment to ensure that you're resilient, to ensure your business is resilient against attack. And if you don't want it, then you're not going to be my customer. And they say, I'll walk away. Some of them have not gone that far. They'll say, well, there'll be a certain price per employee, per endpoint, per node if you take the entire stack, but it'll be higher if you don't take the full stack that I recommend. So they do it through monetization. And suddenly, people acknowledge, they accept it. And from the MSP point of view, they are happier and their business is doing much better is if they can only take customers with a full stack recommendation.
Well, it's almost an entire conversation on its own, that one, because you're into the compliance conversation as well, because MSPs need to need to cover their own backsides. Basically, they can't be in a position where one of their customers is the weak link in the chain, or
That's right.
even is kind of is potentially putting them at risk as well.
Yeah, but
I,
and I'm characterizing this in the concept of security by default, because from an MSP's point of view, the default they want to do for security is everything, as opposed to coming in after the fact and saying, okay, these are the other products that you'll need to sell them on the security. Is let's not talk about the technology. Let's just say, here's a full stack of my recommendation, call it the premium stack. You need all of this. This is what I need to properly protect your environment and ensure that you're always running.
and I also think it makes life easier for the MSP because you have consistency. If everybody's running the same stack and everybody's using the same tools and your techs are reacting in the same way, so your playbooks, like your business as an MSP operates a lot smoother when you're not going, okay, hang on, Jim's company is running this really niche kind of software that 97% of my other customers don't. All right, well, then I have a whole different set of playbooks, or I may only have one person on staff who's an expert in it. Like, I think that consistency also adds value. The second piece is, and Jim kind of hit on it earlier, is this is what you get. Like, I think about, and I've recently bought car insurance, and I'll use that as an example. When I bought car insurance, they basically came and said, here's what you get. Like, here's your amounts. You get rental car reimbursement, you get this, you get this, you get this. And I didn't really question it. They just said, here's what you're going to get. I tweaked the amounts personally because like I had a different risk aversion. Like I may have wanted to add to it. But at the end of the day, like the insurance company came and said, this is what you need to secure yourself as you drive your vehicle. MSPs can do that same thing. And it's just a bundle. Like at the end of the day, this is what you need to be resilient. Here's how we're going to do it. And again, this is the why. This is not the how. It's all the why. And to your point, then you get a consistent stack that's easy to deliver. And I think the MSPs and the customers both benefit from it.
To switch the focus a little bit now towards vendors more than necessarily MSPs, what challenges do the vendors themselves face in kind of creating and implementing a secure by design architecture? And I'll just start, Dave. I think it's probably you're a good place to start with this one.
Well, so I mean, if we're going to talk about secure by design, I mean that a lot of it has to do with what the business's motivations are. And what I will say is, and especially for me, when I've been with Enable for 3.5 years now, it was making sure I was coming into a culture that wanted to be secure. So from a vendor perspective, if the vendor's focus is profitability and features, then they are likely not going to have as secure of a product versus if they have a balance to, hey, we're going to invest in security. We're going to slow our future development. And Jim, I'm sure he gets frustrated at me at times. We're like, hey, we're going to slow this down because we need to do this thing. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is because it's in the best interest of our customers and ourselves. But that's a cultural thing. And that's part of, like, when we're talking about understanding if you have a vendor you're working with who is secure by design, that's where vendor risk management comes in. That's a whole different podcast. But understanding what that vendor has in place for security, but for themselves, for their code, for change management, it's all those pieces. That is really where, when you're looking at a vendor, what you're looking for. I think the second aspect is the secure by default, which is how do they make sure they're putting that secure configuration out the door? And there's a bunch of different ways to do it. I mean, I think the biggest one here in the US was like the CISA pledge that came out back in, I think, May of this year, where there's 190, maybe 200 companies who signed on and said, hey, we're committing to security in our products. We want secure by default. And we're putting we're writing down our names and saying we are committing to this. That's a big step. I mean, because that's a public statement. You're committing to perform specific actions. So I think it's the combination of vetting the vendor plus making sure that they're actually doing what they say they're going to do, whether it be internally via processes in that review or externally via whether it be blogs, certifications, audit information, et cetera. It's really making sure that you're working with somebody who is truly trusted. Jim, I don't know if you have more you want to add there.
Yeah, what I was thinking about when the question was asked was, I've gone through a lot of transformations when we went from, okay, we thought we were secure, but then we really took it serious. We put in a lot of process. We put in a lot of tools. We brought in experts where we wanted to do security by design. And you've got to start somewhere. That's the main thing. As a vendor, you have an existing product. You say, okay, now what do I do? So you start somewhere, but then you always have to budget and think about, how do I retrofit this secure by design? How do I remove all the issues, the vulnerabilities, the risks that have been associated with my prior process, and have a plan for that? It's something that can't be done all at once. Otherwise, it takes years and years and years. But you can get an initial assessment and get an understanding to size how big the challenge, how big the task will be, and then stage it over time. And one thing that I do notice with vendors that you work with, or once you go from whatever you were before to now secure by design, we're all willing to talk about it. We won't talk about how we've done it or what issues we've discovered, but we're willing to talk about the tools we've used, the improvements that we made. We're willing to just take on, if a risk is found, which usually there's risks that are found or vulnerabilities, we can close them very quickly, and we'll talk about it if it's appropriate. So we become very transparent.
And I mean, it's interesting. So talking specifically about the products themselves, I mean, what specific features, configurations can would MSPs expect to be getting in products that are secure by default?
Jim.
So
You want me to go, or you want Jim to go? Yeah.
No, I'm
sorry. I think you
probably both have a long list on that one.
Why don't we brainstorm? So I think DMAC showed one on the phone. When you first log in, you're prompted to change your password. You're prompted to change to a strong password, and you're prompted to use MFA. So that's your initial default is when you get into it. Your ports are closed. Your services aren't running. They're running with least permissions. What else do we got there?
Well, I mean, for me, there's a long list. Do you have documentation? Do you talk about how can you limit like when you talk role-based access control? Do you integrate into other identity providers and things like that? So, hey, we've rolled our own versus is there a third party that we work with that we trust? I think there's also what information you provide to me about how you verify that this is secure. So when we talk about, and especially in SaaS-based products where it's internet exposed, whether it runs in your cloud or in the vendor's cloud, but what are they doing around penetration testing? Like, is that something they're doing annually? Is it something they do once a decade? Are they willing to share any type of attestations? Do they have bug bounty? Again, these are really simple things, but one of the things I say internally, and Jim's heard me say it before, is I want to find the bad things before the bad guys find the bad things. So having those kind of white hats who are ethical hackers trying to break into something is far more valuable than having a black hat who is trying to monetize it, do it. So I think it's not even just a feature, I think it's a culture. And I think that culture should be reflected based upon the actions they're taking both privately and also publicly. And there's lots of ways to do that publicly to help build that confidence that the vendor you're working with is giving you something that is secure by default.
So from a product perspective, when you have secure by default, that's really where you expect that all detection engines are engaged. So you have an incoming email, and it could be at one point in time to where you had a couple engines that would detect 90% of stuff being engaged, but those one-offs that were looking for very unique stuff might not be engaged. We left it to a user to turn it on, or the security operations team to turn it on. And so now by default, we turn all engines on. They detect as much as they can. They block by default. The software makes a decision to block. You don't leave it up to a user to decide, should you block this? And that was across the board of whether it was endpoint security, you block email security, cloud security, even data loss prevention. You don't just set it to monitor mode, you set it to block mode if you think intellectual property is being exfiltrated out the system. So you try to engage as many engines, and that's what you get. You get the highest level of protection that the product can offer.
Dave, anything else to add in that sort of in that really?
No, I mean, I think Jim hit the nail on the head. I mean, you think about, like, I'm a car guy, so I always use car analogies, but like when I buy a car, I don't have to go turn the airbag on. The airbag's on by default.
Nice.
It's and at my car I don't know how many airbags. It's got a ton. I don't have to turn on the forward collision detection. I don't have to turn on the lane departure detection. I don't have to turn it, like, those are all on my car out of the box because it makes it more secure to drive. Your technology stack should be doing that exact same thing. And that is the intent behind secure by default. You're not having to go figure out how do you turn on that airbag. The airbag's on for you. If you're going to turn it off, we're going to notify you. Hey, there's risk in doing this. Probably you shouldn't do that. But you're going to get it out of the box. Like, that to me is kind of the mindset people should come into it with. Like, if it protects my organization in an effective way, the vendor should be turning it out of the box.
Yeah, flip side is you do want to give the option to turn things off. So don't be confused with secure by default, as in don't give the partner, the user, the option to turn something off they need to make sure their business runs, but have it on by default so they don't forget, so they don't make mistakes, so they don't have to understand the complexity of ensuring their environment or their customer environments is fully protected.
And I suppose as directly related to that is essentially if you give somebody the opportunity to switch something off, then at least you can go through the process of analysing the risk of turning that off and then deciding whether the risk is worth it.
That's right. Are you sure you want to do this?
It needs to be clear. Yeah, it needs to be clear.
Exactly.
Like it can't be like, oh, you just turn this off and the platform goes, hey, good job, you turned off MFA. There's going to be are you really sure you want to do this? Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? And then when you click yes 3 or 4 times, then the system actually does it for you. And again, I think it's just the awareness to understand that the action you're taking has a negative impact to your overall security.
The question really that comes to my mind off the back of that is, does or should even secure by default come at a premium, or should it just be included as part of the deal, if you see it?
Will you pay extra to be? No, you should pay more if it's not secure by default, because the risk is you're inheriting that risk. So that's what the partners were for their customers. They're saying you can change the configuration. You cannot deploy the secure things that I recommend, but I'm going to charge you more because that risk goes to the person managing that security. They've got more alerts. They're going to have to answer that question sooner or later. How'd I get breached? And that's what you're trying to prevent, is you prevent the breach. And if you're turning things off because you're trying to balance availability or user experience, then that's a door that you're opening up. That's a window you're opening up. That is where an attacker is going to get through. So that's risk that's been transferred from one party to another party. That should come as a premium.
Dave?
I have a very, very elaborate answer. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it. Hell no. No. Like, we should never charge for security. Now, also realize I'm biased. Like, this is my job. It's what I'm passionate about. But I don't go. I'll go back to the car. I don't go to the car dealership and be like, hey, I would like to buy the seat belts. You get them by default. I don't want to buy the airbags. You get them by default. The dealership doesn't charge me more for those. You get it with the car. Software providers should do the exact same thing, whether it's SaaS, on-prem, I don't care. You should get security features built in out of the box for no additional charge. Like, if you're charging for MFA, that is a vendor you probably don't want to do business with, because they are not acting in your best interest. And at the end of the day, as a customer, us acting in your best interest is good for both of us. And that's why we call them partners. So that I'm pretty passionate about this. I don't think anybody should ever charge for security features in a platform. Now, I get there are some security platforms where you may want to do enhancements, like when and that's kind of being very, very specific. But the default features to secure the platform is something we should never charge for, period.
I was going to say, do you hear that happening? Do you encounter that?
No, where I see it, especially, and I don't want to mention specific vendors, is they'll give you a certain amount of capacity. So like, hey, we're gonna give you audit logging. We'll give you 30 days. If you want more than 30 days, then you start paying for it.
Okay.
But if they give you a faculty to say, I'm going to take those audit logs and I can shift them out to whatever your SIM is or somewhere else, I feel like they're providing the opportunity for you to leverage whatever pathway works best for you. Whether you want to pay for that for extended retention, you can, or you can shunt it somewhere else. And that puts the burden of responsibility on the customer. But they're not charging you for like the initial, I'm going to charge you for these audit events. I'm just going to charge you for more than a certain amount of time, because at that point it should fall into that customer ecosystem. So I think that's where the balance is, and you probably see it more. I have not seen historically, I have not seen where they're charging for that. I know that was when we went through the secure by default work with CISA last year and JCDC. That was one of these specific things that was called out, was to make sure we don't start to charge for that, because we shouldn't. Again, like that's why I said my answer is really simple. Hell no, we should never do that as an industry.
Go back to your car example. You buy a new car and someone's like, here you go, here's your brand new car. But if you want locks, that's extra.
Yeah. You want a key to start it? Oh, we just have these two wires you tap together, it fires right up.
Yeah, if you want an ignition, that's $3,000 extra.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So you just interestingly, you touched on the CISA JCDC stuff there as well. I mean, is that driving change in our industry now?
In our industry, I can't speak for the other vendors, because candidly, I don't know everything that they're doing or not doing. I think it's creating a change in the IT software industry, which is where the intention is. I mean, when you look at the players who have signed that pledge, it's everywhere from the behemoths to smaller organizations, and I would consider ourselves one of the smaller organizations. We're 1,800 people, to large organizations which are several hundred thousand. So I think the intent was to capture opportunities that, regardless of organization size, people can adhere to. I think it does drive change for the better. And while it is driven kind of out of the U.S. government, it's not intended to be a U.S.-centric guidance. It can be used globally anywhere. And I do hope and expect it will basically transform most organizations to start doing this, or I hope it does, as kind of a de facto standard that everybody adheres to.
That was going slightly off track with that, but you mentioned it, so I thought it was kind of you mentioned that, so I thought it was kind of worth pulling that one up. But so I suppose really to wrap it up, let's gaze into our crystal balls for a second. Obviously, we've transitioned, if you like, or added on top the extra layer. We've gone from secure by design, secure by default. Where's next? Where are we going? What happens next? What's the next phase of development, I suppose, in keeping that one step ahead of the bad guys? Dave.
So staying one step ahead of the bad guys is always the biggest challenge. I think the biggest transition you're going to see is security transparency. In order to be secure by design and secure by default, and Jim actually mentioned this earlier, he was like, vendors will talk about this. We may not tell you exactly how we make, what's in the recipe, but we'll tell you how we're doing things in an effective manner. I think that transparency is absolutely critical as it comes to security, because it's the only way for you to have confidence that whatever vendor you're working with is doing the right things to help protect you and your customers. So that I hope we see continue. But that's kind of one of the big things that comes, and I'll go back to the JCDC pledge. One of the big things that comes out of that is that transparency from the vendors to share what they're doing from a security perspective to improve the ecosystem.
Jim, anything to add to that?
Not to that. I'm going back to, that is our job. We are always trying to figure out what they're going to do next. And so it doesn't go along with the trend of security by design, the trend of security by default, but it really is the trend of understanding the threat space and looking for that little thing that's going to be different. What's different now that wasn't there before? What's that little sign that something is going to become more widespread? A new attack trend, a new attack vector, some new technique that you've never expected before. And then the challenge is coming up with a capability that can then be deployed for customers to better protect their environment without fully impacting them. But that's the big challenge there. So I don't know what comes next as a trend, but to keep ahead of the threat actors of the threat space, that's why we're in this business, to always try to keep ahead of them. And the truth is, it's not a vendor that does it. It's not a partner that does it. It really is a community that does it together, a community that works together. It's the customer, the vendor, the partners. It's those that have the information, our internal security guys like DMAC, the product guys, the product people that do it all together. That's how we accomplish this.
Okay. Jim, Dave, thank you very much. That's been a fascinating conversation, and hopefully our listeners have got some useful takeaways from that. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to doing it again.
Thank you, Pete.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dave.